Wage theft is prevalent throughout the state of Ohio, and City Council continues to take action against it. Today on City Chat, Council's Wage Theft Commission signed a historic agreement with the U.S. Department of Labor to promote the improvement of city labor laws and regulations. Here with us today to discuss this new agreement and wage theft prevention is Council President Pro Tem Rob Dorans. Council Pro Tem, thank you for coming into studio and coming onto this show today to talk to us about wage theft.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really looking forward to it.
Can you just give us a little bit of a background on yourself and why wage theft prevention and just families in general is something that's so dear to you?
Yeah, so I joined council in 2019 and was fortunate to be elected by the voters that year and have served in a variety of different committees during my time on council. And prior to joining Columbus City Council, I've been a union attorney for my whole career. So I've been really engaged with workers across, not only here in Columbus, but across the state of Ohio, and really worked on issues, as small as individuals that were not being paid by their employer, all the way up to sort of class actions, in which we've seen dozens, if not hundreds, of folks that were really being defrauded by their employer. And one of the things when I joined council was thinking about what kind of public policy we could implement here in Columbus to make sure that workers in our city were treated fairly. And that's something that during my time on council really tried to make sure that we've been a leader in this area, because at the end of the day, if a family doesn't have economic stability, it's really, really difficult for them to thrive. And I think that's something that during my time on council I've been very proud to focus on.
Yeah, that's amazing. The press conference that we covered beginning of this month, I liked how you were like, billions of dollars are being taken away from families, and I'm really excited to actually dive into this conversation. Can you tell us what wage theft is for people that don't know, and why it's so important that the city take action?
Yeah, so wage theft at its most basic form is when an employer fails to pay their employee for hours that they've worked. And this can take a number of different forms, right? So oftentimes you hear like these big terms like wage theft or payroll fraud or independent contractor abuse. It's like, again, what exactly does that mean on its most basic level? So I'll give you a couple of examples. So a really common form of wage theft is when an employer says you need to show up at 9 a.m. for your shift, but I'm not going to start paying you until 9:30. So there's a half an hour for that individual every single day in which they're required to be at work, but their employer's not paying them. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act, they should be compensated for that time. There's other issues that are out there. Ohio has a prevailing wage law that ensures that individuals that are working on public construction projects are paid a certain type of wage for the type of work that they're doing. We see, unfortunately, contractors all the time that basically skirt that law and pay them a lower wage basically to profit for themselves. So it's really the most basic thing when we boil it down to is someone is not being paid the wages that they should be. And when we talk about like how big of a problem this is, the Economic Policy Institute did a study over a 3-year period. They found that over $3 billion were stolen from workers. And I want to underline that. This isn't just a mistake. This isn't just something that just happened. I mean, these were oftentimes intentional acts that happened from employers that took dollars from individuals' pockets. And we think about what that means to families. That means less food on the table. That means they're stretching their budgets, even though they should have been owed those wages. So when we talk about this being something that is a huge issue, but also very very micro level affects individuals on a daily basis being able to provide for their families.
So when it does come to these employees that are victims of wage theft, how are they being easily deceived by their employers?
No, that's a great question, and I think it fundamentally comes down to many workers don't know their rights, and that's something that unfortunately we don't teach young folks in this country what their rights in the workplace are. There's no high school class that tells every young person here's what the Fair Labor Standards Act is, here's what these workplace protections are, and if an employer violates these, here's how you actually get redress from them. Unfortunately, we just don't do a very good job in our country of making sure that workers are well educated about what their legal rights are. So oftentimes what happens is that individuals don't know that they're actually owed these wages for a very long time. And if you think about it, unfortunately, the bargaining relationship between an individual employee and their employer, it's really an outsized power balance, right? in which it's sometimes difficult for an individual worker to say to their boss or their employer, hey, I actually think you're doing something wrong here, and I think I should be compensated for the time that I've put in. That's a pretty uncomfortable conversation, especially if you don't have a lot of power in your workplace, right? So that's why I think it's really important for us to uplift the work of the Central Ohio Workers Center here in Columbus that's doing great work, especially with low-wage and immigrant workers here in our community that are at most risk of not knowing what their rights are. And I think that's something that from a educational standpoint that Columbus has been, I think, proud to partner with that Workers Center and folks in the labor community to make sure that individuals know more about what their rights are compared to oftentimes when these things do occur, it's simply because an individual worker just doesn't know that this fraud is happening to them.
We are, so lucky to have you on our side for, defending that and just standing up for, what is not fair, So who is protected under the Columbus Wage Theft Ordinance, and how can these people, these potential victims, take action if they believe that they are a victim of wage theft?
Yeah, so we designed our wage theft law to try and be as broad as possible. One of the things that is very confusing in this area is that mostly, these wage protection laws are at the federal and state level. So what we tried to do here in Columbus was make sure that we were providing an additional avenue for folks to be able to protect themselves. So our law applies to folks that work directly on city contracts. They apply directly to projects that have received some type of financial incentive from the city. And what we've really wanted to do is allow for our Wage Theft Commission to make sure that they're able to request information from employers when they suspect fraud has happened. And employers can go to that Wage Theft Commission and file a complaint. They can go to the Worker Center that I mentioned earlier that's doing a lot of educational and outreach efforts for us and let them know about, hey, this has happened to me, is this right? And then our Wage Theft Commission is able to pass that information on, whether it's the state of Ohio or whether it's the U.S. Department of Labor. And I think the other thing that's really important to point out about our law is that it really tries to make sure that when a employer intentionally steals from their workers, that there's actual consequences for that. I think one of the things that frustrates, I think, a lot of individuals is that when an employer intentionally, again, reaches into an employee's pocket and takes money out of it, oftentimes the response is a slap on the wrist. It's, hey, actually, pay that worker what they're owed, and they move on from there. Yeah. Well, if you're just being told, hey, pay the money back and move on, that's not much of a consequence, right? People don't rob a bank and then just say, hey, give the money back, and we're not going to send you to prison now, right? But unfortunately, with this type of theft, that's oftentimes what occurs. So what our law does basically spells out that if you steal from your workers and the U.S. Department of Labor or the state of Ohio says that in fact did occur, we're not going to do business with you for 3 years. And that's a pretty significant penalty in order for that to happen. And I think it's also helpful to point out that this is also about making sure that businesses that are doing things the right way aren't competing against employers that are, again, defrauding their workers. So, again, at the end of the day, we want employers to be good citizens in our community and treat their workers with dignity. And that also means that they then should not be competing for city contracts or city incentives against folks that have a history of stealing from the workers. So not only does this law, I think, help protect workers, but I also think it promotes better business practices for folks that we want to do business with here in Columbus.
There's kind of like 3 steps to what you're working on here. So we had the ordinance that was passed in 2020, and then you guys, City Council, established the Wage Theft Enforcement and Prevention Commission. Can you talk a little bit how that's run and who all is involved and how it benefits citizens?
Yeah, so the Wage Theft Commission was set up after we passed the legislation in 2020. And really this commission is a broad representative of the community. There's folks from organized labor that are there. There's folks from the business community that are on that commission as well. And their role really is to make sure that they're developing administrative rules to make sure that as it applies to development sites that have received incentives, that there's a clear process for the city to request information from those folks working on those sites to make sure that folks are doing things the right way. And also then receive complaints from workers that think there may have been an issue and to make sure they're processing those complaints and then sending them to the most appropriate body. And it's really also at the same time they've been able to partner with, again, organizations like the Central Ohio Workers Center to make sure that we're doing that advocacy out in the community. Because to the point that you made earlier about one of the things that the reason this fraud occurs is because people just don't know what they don't know. And I think that Wage Theft Commission has been able to partner with organizations outside of the City Hall to make sure that we're actually getting to folks to make sure that they understand what their rights are in the workplace.
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. And then more recently, at the beginning of this month, there was a signed memorandum of understanding with the U.S. Department of Labor. Can you speak to how, you did touch on it, but can you speak to how this will further, protect Columbus workers?
Yeah, so the Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, with the Department of Labor is a historic thing for Columbus. We're the only city in the country that has entered into one of these kind of agreements with the U.S. Department of Labor. These types of agreements historically in the past have only been with state entities. So what this allows us to do is really to gain access to the information they have about the investigations that they've taken on, right? So one of the key elements of our law is that, again, if you violated a wage and hour law in the prior 3 years, we're not going to do business with you, right? So it's somewhat difficult at times for the city to know who those entities are, and this MOU will allow us actually to interact directly with the U.S. Department of Labor to make sure that we know who these players are, to make sure that we're actually able to fully implement our law. So, one of the things that as a legislature, we can put all the great ideas and pass them at council, but if they're not actually being implemented correctly and enforced, they're not good for anyone in our community. Right? So one of the things that I think this MOU really does is make sure that our Wage Theft Commission is really in the position to implement this law in the right way.
This law that's effective now with the U.S. Department of Labor in Ohio, is that like effective in other states, or is it just Ohio?
So the information that we're getting from the U.S. Department of Labor is nationwide, and I think that's one of the really important things is that, especially for if the city is contracting with a business outside of our community, sometimes it's difficult to know who we're working with, right? And I think this MOU really gives us a nationwide lens to make sure that, again, if we're going to make the statement that we only want to do business with companies and employers that are doing things the right way and taking care of their employees, then we need to have this kind of information at our fingertips. And it can't just mean, hey, we just know these folks do the things the right way because we know them from our backyard, right? What happens when, a contractor or an employer or a service provider comes in from out of state or from across the country for that matter. This allows us to know that, to make sure that, again, if we're going to make that statement that we don't want to do business with folks that have stolen from their workers, that we're actually able to make that commitment and actually mean it.
In your opinion, why do you think that you and your team were able to convince, the Department of Labor to agree and sign this agreement?
Yeah, I think, it took a lot of months of sort of back and forth between the Department of Labor, the city attorney's office to make sure that, this sort of arrangement worked for everyone. And I think one of the things that, the Department of Labor said to us was they just don't see as many cities leading on this issue as they would like. So while there's a number of cities across the country that have a wage theft law or wage theft ordinance, there's not, I think, the intent that we've tried to do here, in which we're really going after, again, making sure that, projects that have, or maybe on the private side, but have received city support are covered by these types of wage protections, and also covered by the scrutiny that comes with taking the incentive, right? So again, at the end of the day, I think that's one thing the Department of Labor saw in what we're doing here in Columbus, to say that we're a growing city. We know that this economic development is happening, but we want to make sure that workers aren't suffering because of that development. And I think that was one thing in our conversation with us that they felt was rather unique that Columbus was doing and wanted to be a part of it.
That's great. So as the commission continues to work on combating wage theft in Columbus, what do you think that the future of wage theft prevention looks like for our city?
Yeah, I'm really hoping that the commission, that the law itself really helps to prevent these issues from happening in the first place. You'd much rather have families not go through these kinds of situations and have to come to either the city or the Department of Labor in order to get what they're owed to begin with. I'm really hoping this continues to spur conversation with employers here in Columbus. I recently spoke with folks from the local Chamber of Commerce, and they've done, I think, some good educational efforts with their members. So I think there's just more education to do, whether or not it's directly from the city or commission or from partners outside council. And I think also at the same time as, again, the city continues to grow, I mentioned earlier that we've identified, several key industries that historically these kinds of issues have cropped up in. I think it's also important for us to continue to look and see whether or not there's other industries as we grow that this is becoming a problem, and what if any kind of legislative solution that we have out there. The city itself can't stop all bad things from happening to folks, but we certainly have to be aware and making sure that we're doing our best to protect folks who are trying to make a living in our community.
We're really lucky to have you taking the lead on this, so thank you.
Thanks for having me, I appreciate it.
I'm Josie Smith. Thanks for watching City Chat on CTV.